Thank you for joining us. We're going to spend some time today talking about E-2 visa, investor requirements and renewal considerations, and hopefully cover everything you always wanted to know about the E-2 visa. A few things before we get started. Some of you may know that this firm was founded on an E-2 visa over 10 years ago. Our founder is in the US personally on an E-2 visa, so is very familiar with what you're going through. The E-2 for the firm has also been renewed once, and we're happy to share our experience with you if you have specific questions on that. Scott Legal is a full-service immigration firm, but focuses primarily on E-2 visas. We've processed hundreds of these visas, and our primary two consulates are London and Toronto. We will continue our webinar series, doing at least 2 webinars a month on different topics. At the end of this webinar, you'll also receive a few things. So one is the PowerPoint that you'll see today. You'll also receive an E-2 visa guide and a link to where you can sign up for additional webinars. For our panelists today, we're very lucky to have Michaela Vrazdova, who is a senior associate at Scott Legal and has vast experience processing E-2 visas. My name is Kelly LeGrand Wiener, and I'm the managing attorney at Scott Legal and also have significant experience with E-2 visas. If you have questions throughout the presentation, please send them in the chat box. We will either get to them during the presentation or we'll make time at the end for questions. And finally, this webinar is being recorded and will be made available on our YouTube channel. So without further delay, I'm going to turn it over to Michaela to talk to us a little bit about the E-2 visa rules and regulations.
Thank you, Kelly, and good afternoon, everyone. So let's go over some basics. So E-2 visa is a non-immigrant visa that allows nationals of certain countries to come to the US to develop and direct operations of an enterprise in which they invested a substantial amount of money. So there are basically 2 options how you can qualify for an E-2 visa. So you can either purchase an already existing business or you can start your own business in the US. Regarding purchasing an already existing business, this can be basically any business. It can also be a franchise. We see franchises quite a lot. And when kind of like thinking what kind of business you want to purchase, it can be a business in basically any industry, but you would want to review the financials of the business you will be purchasing, and you would want to kind of like take a look at hiring history of that particular company. And we'll go over in more detail what you should be looking at in terms of hiring. And then the second option, as I already mentioned, how you can qualify for an E-2 visa is if you start your own company in the US. So this is going to be a startup, and you would be basically setting up a company in the US and kind of investing in the new company and buying anything that the new company needs to kind of start operations in the US. So in order to qualify for an E-2 visa, you must be a national of an E-2 visa treaty country. So many countries from all over the world are E-2 visa treaty countries. So many countries from, for example, from Europe, Africa, Asia, Latin America, Middle East are E-2 visa treaty countries. And what is important to just kind of mention here is that for the E-2 visa, what is important is the country of your nationality and not the country of birth. So, let's say, for example, that you were born in India or China, that are not E-2 visa treaty countries, but later in your life, you acquired citizenship of another country, such as, for example, Canada, UK, Germany, or any other E-2 visa treaty country. You could qualify through that new passport, through that new nationality for an E-2 visa, and the country of birth would not be kind of like important in the E-2 treaty country visa kind of like analysis. So for how long can you get an E-2 visa approved? So this is also going to depend on your country of nationality. Nationals of some countries can get the E-2 visas for up to 5 years. Nationals of other countries can get it for anywhere basically from a couple months up until 5 years. But even if you get the E-2 visa approved only for 1 year or only for a couple of months, you could still, every time you enter the United States on that visa, you could always get 2 years in E-2 status in the US. So let's say that your E-2 visa was only approved for 3 months. You can enter the US on that visa, and then you could still stay in the US for up to 2 years on E-2 status. But then the kind of like the moment you leave the US and your visa is no longer valid, then you would have to go back to the consulate and apply for a new E-2 visa. Perfect. So now let's discuss the E-2 visa requirements in a little bit more detail. So as we mentioned already, the first requirement is that you must be a national of an E-2 visa treaty country. The second requirement is that you must make an investment in the United States. And what is important to keep in mind here is that the money you are investing in the E-2 business must be what we call at risk. And this means that the money you are investing must be actually spent at the time you are applying for an E-2 visa. It cannot just be sitting on your bank account. So at the time you are applying for the E-2 visa, the investment already kind of like has to be made. You know, you cannot just kind of like have the money on bank account and plan to make the investment in the future. Regarding the E-2 investment, you know, you will have to explain in the application where the investment money is coming from. So this is called source of funds. It can come from any legitimate source. It can come, for example, from your personal savings from employment. It can come from a sale of property, sale of business. You know, someone can gift you the money, a family member or anyone can gift you the money, but then we would have to explain where that person who is gifting you the money got the money from, or it can also come from a loan. The only caveat about the loans is that the loan should not be secured by the assets of the E-2 company, but it can be secured by you know, your personal assets, or it can also be just an unsecured loan. And then the E-2 investment you will be making must be substantial. And we'll go over this in more detail on the next slide. So now, you know, what are some typical E-2 visa expenditures? So, you know, as we discussed in the beginning, if you are buying an existing business in the US, the E-2 investment would basically be kind of the purchase price you are paying for the business. But if you are starting your own business from scratch, then we would be kind of like including any expenditures you make to get the new business up and running in what we call investment schedule, and that would be part of your E-2 investment. So some typical E-2 expenditures are, for example, an inventory. You know, if you will be selling some goods in the US, then we could include the inventory. We could include any equipment you purchased. So, for example, computer equipment, you know, printers, scanners, you know, any equipment you need for the company, we could include that. We could include any kind of like money you spend to set up the company's website. any money you spend on office supplies, any money you pay for an office rent. And here it's just important to mention that, for example, if you prepay the rent for 6 or 12 months or even more, we could include all that money you prepay in advance. So, this is a good, if you kind of like need to increase the investment amount, you can just kind of like prepay the rent for some period of time. Any money you spend on marketing, we could include as part of the E2 investment, or, any money you spend to set up the business entity, or you pay to, business attorneys to kind of like set up the entity for you. And so, one other thing I just wanted to mention, in case you are thinking about purchasing an already existing business in the US, is that there is, if you'll be buying a business, there is an option to do it through an escrow, and this would be fine for an E2 visa. The only thing, about this is that the escrow transaction, the only contingency can be the approval of the E2 visa, and there can be no other contingencies. So basically, you would sign a purchase sale agreement, you would sign an escrow agreement, and if the only contingency is the approval of the E2 visa, once the E2 visa is approved, then the funds would be transferred from the escrow agent to the seller. And, in case the E2 application would not be approved, the funds would be transferred back to you by the escrow agent. So then the next requirement for the E2 visa is that the E2 business cannot be marginal, and we'll go over this in more detail later in the presentation, but this basically means that the business must have either present or future capacity to employ US employees. Generally, we want to see that the company will have at least 3 full-time employees by year 5 of operations. But again, we'll go over this in more detail in a bit. The next requirement for the E2 is that the business must be real and operating. And so what this means is that, the company already has to be taking revenue from clients, or, if it's not taking revenue yet, kind of everything has to be set up, everything has to be ready. And the only thing that is kind of like missing is your E2 visa approval. And once you come to the US, the company will kind of start operating and taking revenue from clients immediately. And, so how can you show that the company is real and operating? So if your company, so let's say that you bought an already existing business, in that case, it would be kind of like pretty easy to meet this requirement. You would submit evidence such as, the company's bank statements showing that the company is already taking revenue. You would submit the company's invoices to clients. You would submit the company's tax returns and profit and loss statement, again, kind of showing that the company is taking revenue. You would submit evidence that the company has employees. So it would be pretty easy to kind of like meet this requirement. Now, let's say that you are starting your company in the US, and you don't have any employees in the US yet. You plan to hire employees in the future, but you kind of like want to come to the US to start the operations of the company. So now, what kind of evidence can you submit in that case to show that the company is real and operating? So you could submit evidence such as signed commercial lease agreement showing that the company has an office space. You would submit evidence that the business entity was established. You would submit evidence that the company has a website created. You know, if you already have any contracts with clients signed for future work, you could submit evidence of that. Or you could also submit letters of intent from potential clients to meet the real and operating requirement. The next requirement is that you, as the E-2 investor, are coming to the US to develop and direct the E-2 company. So this means that you know, your intent or the reason why you are coming to the US is to manage the E-2 company. And this can be usually shown by, you know, explaining in the application, like what will be your position for the company, what kind of job duties you will be doing, and you know, your focus as the E-2 investor should be on the kind of like high level executive or managerial duties. The next very important requirement is that you must own at least 50% in the E-2 company. And this requirement has to be met at the time you apply for the E-2 visa, but have to, you know, you have to always keep at least 50% ownership. Otherwise, you know, like let's say that you would sell, you know, you owned 50% at the time of applying, but then you sell 10% to someone else, you know, in that case, you would no longer be kind of like meeting the E-2 visa requirements. So this is extremely important to keep in mind, that you always have to keep the at least 50% ownership even after the E-2 visa is approved. And the last requirement is that you must have intent to return to your home country once the E-2 visa expires. And so this is just because the E-2 visa is still a non-immigrant visa, but the standard how to meet this requirement is kind of much lower for the E-2 than it is, for example, for a B1 or B2 visa. And how this requirement is usually met is by submitting a signed declaration of your intent to return to your home country once your E-2 visa expires. And usually the government, the consulates just want to see this signed declaration, and in most cases, they don't want to see anything else. Perfect. So now let's discuss in a bit more detail how much money you have to invest. So this is so-called substantiality requirement for the E-2. And so there is no kind of like a minimum set amount in the regulations kind of defining, you know, like how much money is enough. And you know, like how much money is going to be enough will depend on a couple of things. So it's going to depend on you know, like what is the type of business you are starting. So you know, you will need to invest a different amount of money when you are starting, for example, a consulting business where you don't need to buy any inventory, you don't need to buy any equipment. So, you know, for consulting companies, the investment is kind of like usually much lower. And, you know, you would have to invest a different amount if you're, for example, opening like a manufacturing company. So it's going to depend on the type of business you are starting. It's also going to depend on the location where you are applying for the E-2 visa, and on the officer who is going to review the application. So there are some consulates that, you know, they are just kind of like used to seeing high investment amounts, you know, a couple $100,000. So you know, if you apply at that consulate and your investment is only around like $60,000-$70,000, you know, the consulate, the officers may just not be used to seeing such a low investment. So kind of like the location, the venue where you are applying is definitely going to affect this. And then it will, another factor we need to look at is kind of like the overall strength of your application. So, for example, if your investment amount is lower, let's say around like $60,000-$70,000, but the company already has 2 employees at the time you are applying for the visa, you already signed, several contracts with clients, the company's already taken revenue, in that case, like even the investment amount is lower, but the other kind of like aspects of the application are strong, the application could still be approved. So now let's talk a little bit more about the proportionality test. So, and this is how the government kind of like determines whether your investment amount is substantial. So the government looks at how much money you invested in the business, and then they look at how much money or what are the usual costs associated with establishing the type of business you are starting. And if the amounts are the same or kind of like very similar, then the investment would be considered substantial. In case you are buying a business, then the test would be how much money you paid to purchase that particular business, and what is the fair market value of the business. And again, if the amounts are very similar, then your investment in that business would be substantial. So as I mentioned already, franchises are good option for an E-2 visa. We have done many different types of franchises. So that's definitely a good option if you're kind of like looking to purchase a business in the US. And let's talk a little bit more about some weak E-2 visa expenditures. So I already mentioned some of like the the typical and strong E-2 visa expenditures, but there are some expenditures that are just considered weak for the E-2 investment, and we usually don't recommend to include them. So these are, for example, money you spend on flight tickets. So we usually don't recommend to include them, just because they're not really related to kind of like starting the business in the US. Any money you pay for transportation, like Ubers or gas for your car, we don't generally recommend to include those. Now, one question we often get is whether you can purchase a car in the US and include that as a portion of your E-2 investment. And this is going to depend on what your company is doing. So, let's say that you have a consulting company that is doing like an IT consulting, and you want to buy a car so you can travel to and from work every day. So, in this case, we wouldn't include the car as part of the E-2 investment, just because the car, you don't need the car to kind of like provide the services to your clients. But, like, let's say that you are starting like a transportation company or like a construction renovation company, in that case, we can definitely make the argument that you need the car to kind of like do this particular, business. So we could include the car in the investment schedule. Perfect. So let's discuss the kind of like the hiring and the employees a little bit more. So this is one of the most common questions we get, and it's do I need to hire employees, and how many employees do I need to hire to kind of be approved for the E-2 visa. So, so a couple kind of like comments on this. So, you know, one thing is you do not need to have employees already kind of like working for the company at the time you are applying for the E-2 visa. Now, you know, it's definitely like if you're starting a new company in the US, it's definitely going to be helpful if you have at least one employee, even if it's a part-time employee at the time of your interview. But I would say that in the majority of cases we do for new companies, you know, the companies don't have any employees at the time the investor is applying for the visa, and the, you know, the application can still be approved. So you don't need to have an employee, but it's definitely going to be helpful if you do. As I mentioned in the beginning, you know, generally in the application, we would want to show that you plan to have at least 3 full-time employees by year 5 of operations. So if you are starting a new company in the US, we would usually submit a business plan with your application, and in that business plan, you know, we would describe what your hiring projections are. And yeah, the consults would generally want to see at least 3 full-time employees. Now, you know, do those kind of workers have to be W-2 employees, or can they be 1099 contractors? So I would say that ideally, you know, they would be W-2, kind of like full-time employees. But let's say that you have a construction company or a company, you know, in an industry where it's like very common to hire independent contractors for work. You know, we could kind of explain that in the application, and you know, and kind of like argue that, you know, the application or the renewal application should still be approved even with the 1099 contractors. But even in those cases, you know, when the company is like a construction company and hires 1099 contractors for, you know, to do the work, we still recommend to have, you know, at least like an administrative employee or some employees as W-2 employees. And so how do you kind of show, or how do you prove that, you know, you plan to have you plan to hire employees? So as I mentioned, if you're starting a new business, you would be submitting a business plan with the application. And then in case you are purchasing an already existing business, then we would be submitting evidence such as the company's W-2s for the past 3 years, the company's pay stubs, and the company's tax returns, you know, like showing how much the company paid to employees before you purchased it.
Perfect. So Michaela, before we move to the next slide, somebody had asked a question, you know, about how many employees they should hire, which I think, you know, you've answered here. And another part of this question they asked is kind of, what is the minimum wage you have to pay these employees?
Yeah, so, you know, the minimum wage should comply with kind of like the minimum state and kind of like the minimum federal wage. So it should mean, you know, like those requirements. For the E-2, you know, there is kind of like no extra requirement as to, you know, like how much you need to pay to the employees. But yeah, you just want to comply with the other kind of like labor laws.
Perfect. Thank you.
Perfect. And yeah, so now let's discuss some business plan considerations. So do you need to submit a business plan with your application? So, you know, if you are starting a new company in the US, then you will definitely need to submit a business plan with your application, you know, because the business plan will kind of describe, you know, what your company will be doing. The business plan will describe the hiring projections, kind of like will have the financials. So it's an extremely important part of the E-2 visa application. If you are buying an already existing business, then in in most cases you would not need the business plan, just because if you are buying a company, we would be submitting evidence such as the company's tax returns, that would show how the company has been doing financially. So in majority of cases, when you are buying a business, you would not need a business plan. So now, what should the business plan contain? So one of the most important parts of the business plan is going to be an executive summary. And so this is the first page of the business plan, and we usually recommend to put the following information there. So it should have a section who you are. So that should describe, what is your company, what is the company doing, what do you do? So this would be, what kind of services you are providing, or what kind of products are you selling, and then who do you sell to? So this would explain who is your target market. And this is very important part of the business plan, just because many of the consular officers or USCIS officers, when they are kind of like reviewing the E-2 visa petition, which, sometimes has like a couple hundred of pages, and when they're kind of like looking at the business plan, the executive summary is the first page they will look at. So it should really, you should spend some time kind of like putting it together, and it will have kind of like the most important information about the company there. Another kind of like important portion of the business plan is going to be the market analysis and market research. So here you would basically do a market research in your particular geographical area where the company will be operating, and you would compare, your company to the competitors and explain, what are advantages of your company. Another important portion would be your marketing plan. So here you would need to explain, why you expect that the company will be kind of successful in the US. So you should in detail kind of like explain how do you plan to market your services or products to customers. Another extremely important part of the business plan is going to be the personal plan. So as I mentioned, you would want to kind of create a chart that would have 5 years of hiring projections, kind of explaining, like how many employees each year, on what type of position you are planning to hire. You would also want to include the employees' job descriptions and the salaries you are going to pay to the employees. You would also want to include in the business plan a comprehensive financial plan that would have 5 years of financial projections. So here you would be including revenue projections, revenue assumptions. So these are basically like an explanations how you came up with the revenue numbers. And you would also want to include your cash flow projections and balance sheet for the next 5 years. And one question we do get quite often is, whether you need to hire a professional to kind of like help you with the business plan. So the answer is, no, you don't have to, but unless you have a background kind of like, and you are familiar with kind of like drafting business plans, we do recommend that you do hire a professional, just because for the E-2 visas, the business plan is extremely important. So you would want a professional to assist you with the business plan.
Perfect. Thank you, Michaela. So we're going to switch gears a little bit and talk about some E-2 visa developments and adjudication trends. We do have several questions that have come in, and we will get to all the questions at the end. One question that was just quick was whether this webinar will be saved. And yes, this webinar is being recorded and is going to be made available on demand and also available on our YouTube channel. So that will be available to you. Let's talk a little bit about just some trends we're seeing in E-2 visa adjudications. So one is kind of investment purchases in the United States. It's not a requirement that you make your investment in in the US. So if you're buying computer equipment, if you're buying inventory, those purchases can happen outside the United States. However, we are seeing consular officers sometimes ask about how much money has been spent in the United States. And because the E-2 visa is meant to facilitate trade and economic exchange between, countries, we think it is a good idea to spend some of the money in the United States. So if your company is the type where, you're getting your inventory produced abroad and you're bringing it over to the US, that's fine. You can still include those expenditures made outside the US, but we just also recommend making some expenditures inside the United States. Another trend we're seeing is just kind of, cases sometimes being put into administrative processing. So, if your case, basically when you go for your E-2 visa interview at the consulate, your case can either be approved or denied, or it can sometimes be placed into administrative processing. This is usually, you get a form called 221G. It's a technical denial, but really usually what it is either the consulate is asking for some more information from you. So if they want that additional information in order to make a decision, they'll issue that form and they'll indicate to you what information they need and how to provide it to them. Unfortunately, we're seeing an uptick in these. During the pandemic, there was a lot of consular officers that perhaps left the service or, were no longer working there. And as they train new officers, we're seeing a bit more of this where officers sometimes need to confer with supervisors or something like that. And so sometimes they're issuing 221Gs and putting cases into administrative processing for that reason. Cases can also be put into administrative processing for other reasons, sometimes security reasons. Any kind of agency in the United States can kind of flag the visa application if there's kind of a hit on the name in a particular database. And for those cases, it's a bit harder to know when the case will ultimately be resolved. Many cases that are put into administrative processing are ultimately approved. Usually if the case is not, if the person's actually not eligible for the visa, the officer will just deny it instead of putting it into administrative processing. So even if you're put into administrative processing, you still can be approved. Many of cases are, but it just may take longer. And unfortunately, there's not a lot of transparency about how long it will take. Sometimes it can be days, weeks, or even months or longer. So other trends, we're seeing more filings with USCIS, and I think that's really a result of, for a very long time, it was very difficult to get E-2 appointments at consulates, and unfortunately, that is still the case at some consulates. The return to normal in visa processing has been very uneven, kind of depending on where you're applying. So we are seeing more cases filed within the United States because perhaps somebody has a B visa and they come to the US as a business visitor and then they change their status, to get E-2 status. One person did ask this question and I'll address it now because it's relevant to the topic we're covering. Can you apply for the E-2 outside the US, or is it better to apply in the US? So you can apply for the E-2 at a consulate abroad, so outside the US, or if you are in the United States in a valid status that allows you to change status, you can also apply from within the US. There are pros and cons to each. I'll discuss very briefly. So applying outside the United States, I'd say most of the time, this is what we advise for our clients. The reason is if you apply at a consulate, you can get usually, a visa stamp that is often valid for 5 years. While there are, as Michaela mentioned, some countries that have a lower reciprocity schedule, so maybe the visa is only issued for 2 years or 3 years. In some rare cases, sometimes it's only 3 months. But for many, people who are nationals of E-2 treaty countries, they can get that visa for 5 years. And that visa allows them to travel inside and, in and out of the United States, travel internationally. And every time you enter, you get 2 more years in E-2 status. So it just gives you that ability to travel. And, most people like to have that ability. If you file within the United States with USCIS, there's a couple, there's some pros, but there's also some cons. So, one pro obviously is you're not having to wait at a consulate. And sometimes the wait time, maybe you submit your application and then you're waiting a few months, to get an appointment or for them to review the file. So with USCIS, you have a bit more certainty on timing. You submit your application, you can pay for something called premium processing. You can get an answer within 15 calendar days. And another benefit of USCIS is they're often more comfortable with lower investment amounts. So, sometimes I think we've even gone as low as around, 35, 40,000. Those are only cases where they have very, very strong aspects to the case in all other elements. But USCIS is a bit more open to those low investment amounts. The downsides of USCIS, main downside is you're not getting a visa stamp. So even if you get approved, all you're getting is a 2-year approval that allows you to stay in the United States and run the business. However, once you travel outside the United States, that approval doesn't count for anything anymore. And you would have to submit your application to a consulate and they can review it as a brand new application. They don't have to consider that USCIS previously approved you. One other downside of USCIS is just they're very, very exacting on the source and trail of funds. So at a consulate, they might take a very high level view. For example, if it's personal savings from employment, they might just want to see a couple of years of tax returns, proof of you transferring the money and spending it. With USCIS, they would actually want to see that money accumulating in your bank account over many months or years. They'd want to see all the transfers of any money and any explanations. So sometimes, depending on what your source of the investment funds are, it may be better to go to a consulate rather than USCIS, where they're going to do that dollar for dollar accounting. All right, so let's talk about some other trends. So, people ask, is there an impact, to a new administration? Now we're well into the new administration, and really there's not. I think, the pandemic, which was separate, from the political situation, obviously had a really, negative impact on all visa processing, but we did not see huge changes in kind of e-visa approvals in the last administration or in the current administration. The other issues that I think are, on a lot of people's minds, although it's kind of getting better finally, are kind of pandemic issues. I think for a long time, there was a requirement that everybody kind of be vaccinated and also have negative tests to enter the United States. For most countries, the testing requirements are gone, but the vaccine requirement for the US is still in place. So just always really important to kind of stay up to date, look at kind of if you're traveling to a different country for your E-2 visa interview, always look at their requirements regarding this. If you're traveling to the US, always look at the latest CDC guidance to make sure you have that proof of vaccination, or if you're from a country that they're now requiring testing, because that does change sometimes. The consular issues, I'd say, I mentioned previously, but still ongoing. So there's some consulates that are just not accepting E-2 visa applications yet, perhaps due to staffing issues. Most consulates are accepting the applications, but some of them are still taking significantly longer to kind of get people scheduled for appointments. That being said, there are some consulates that are really very back to normal. The U.S. consulates in Japan, the U.S. consulate in London, are generally doing quite well. The U.S. consulate in Canada, they're reviewing the cases rather quickly, within about 10 or 15 business days, and allowing applicants to schedule appointments. But the appointments, sometimes they're available within a month or two, and sometimes they're not available for 4 to 5 months. So there's still a bit of uncertainty regarding where you're applying, how soon you'll be able to get that consular appointment. So you always want to kind of talk through your options with your attorney to see if you do have various options about where to apply. Perhaps you want to, choose maybe one where it's not where you're living. If you have ties to that other country, you may be able to apply there. So always good to kind of examine those options, because the timing is really all over the place right now. All right, let's talk about some issues and complex areas for E-2 visas. So one is the source and trail of funds for USCIS filing. So we talked about this briefly. I think that just generally, again, if you are applying with USCIS, you just need to be prepared to have the exact source and trail of funds for where that money is coming from. And so, for example, like if this money is something that you had from a long time ago and you don't have the documents to show where it came from, or it was some inheritance and you were keeping it in cash, those types of things are really, really difficult with USCIS because they just do require an exact trail of where the money has been whenever you received it up until it was spent on the relevant E-2 expenditures. Other things to consider for the source and trail of funds are, while you can have a loan be the source of funds, so let's say you own a home and you want to take out a home equity line of credit or something like that, a loan or even an unsecured loan, that's fine. What's not okay is to have a loan that is secured by the assets of the E-2 company. So that's kind of the one type of loan you cannot have. So it's very important to have your attorney review any loan agreement prior to kind of getting the funding, just to make sure that you're not securing any of it on the assets of the E-2 business. For that reason, if you're doing a purchase, seller financing is generally not permitted because usually in a seller financing arrangement, the security for the financing are the assets of the business. So, always good to keep that in mind. Gifts as a source of funds are permitted. So that is fine, but you would just need to know what was the source of the person who's giving you the gift. So if you're getting a gift from your parents, you could get a gift letter explaining, they're giving you a gift, but then you would also need them to provide documents explaining where they got that money. So if it was their personal savings from employment, they could include their tax returns, and proof of the money being transferred to you, the investor. Other areas that come up are, small investment amounts. I think, as Michaela kind of mentioned in the section on kind of what is substantial, you always just want to consider, are you meeting that test? Is it substantial in light of the type of business that you're starting up? Some investments are just going to be too small. For example, an investment of $5,000 is just not ever going to be considered substantial, even if you can make an argument that, well, I can run my business with a laptop I already own and I don't need an office. It is an investor visa. You do have to invest a substantial amount. And it's important to explain, why it's substantial and to show that you've spent money on enough various expenditures that you actually do have that business up and running, that you have your marketing strategy in place, that you've gotten all the licenses that you need, that your, corporate entity is set up appropriately. All those things are very important. If it's a business that requires inventory, you have that inventory. If you're opening a restaurant, you have that restaurant space, you have the licenses you need to operate. So you need to think holistically about how you can argue, you spent everything necessary to set up the business. You can also get other things to strengthen cases with small investment amounts. So letters from local business organizations that are supportive of your business, joining a chamber of commerce, making sure you have a detailed business plan, that, you have client contracts. All those things can really help to bolster a case that has a small investment amount. So we'll also talk, E-2 visas for 2 investors. I think this was one of the questions we had on the list. Can you, say you must have 50% ownership? Can 2 E-2 visas get approved with 2 partners with 50% each? Yes, that is possible. If you both want to be investors, then you would both need to make an investment. But it is possible with that structure, but it would need to be that 50-50 structure. So talking about substantive changes to business after filing. This is something that comes up a lot, I would say. People start a business and then they want to make a change to that business. And the question is really like, is the change a natural outgrowth of your business? So let's say that you are a wedding photographer and now you're going to start a blog, where you talk about, you market your kind of your wedding photography, and you talk about different wedding tips and things like that. That's a really related business to your first, to your E-2 business, and that's generally going to be fine. Things that are not going to be fine are if the business is a substantial change from the business that you presented to the consulate. So, let's say that you're a wedding photographer, and then you decide you want to close that business down and run a restaurant. So you would not be permitted to just do that, even if you have a valid E-2 visa. You would first need, to go to the consulate or to go to USCIS, get an approval, for this new line of business, and then you could go ahead and run that business. So if you are considering changes, changes in ownership structure or changes in the type of business, you always want to discuss with your attorney before you make those changes, because they can impact your eligibility. So let's say that you're a 80% owner of your business and you decide you want to sell 30% of it. And now now you don't own 50% of the business. That does impact your eligibility. So you always want to kind of have a strategy in place before any of those changes happen. Another thing people ask about are, family business purchases. So this is possible. It is possible to get an E-2 by purchasing a business from your family member. However, it's going to be scrutinized much more closely. Some consulates really don't like it. And what you want to do is you want to have in place, enough documentation to show that you are actually purchasing it for a fair market value. So perhaps get a third-party valuation, have a CPA do an analysis of the documents, of the financial documents, so that it's just can be shown that even if you're purchasing 50% of the business, that the amount you're purchasing it for is actually, what the 50% is worth. All right. So talking about common reasons for E-2 denials, so one is low investment amount. As we just said, some investments are just going to be, too low. Another is kind of nature of the business. So there are just some businesses that are riskier than others. For example, if you're doing a consulting business and you have no proof of contracts, that can sometimes be a red flag. Also officers sometimes are concerned that a consultant might just operate as a solo consultant and they really want you to hire employees. Other kind of risky, businesses for E-2s are usually businesses that are in real estate. Particularly, if you're going to do any type of house flipping, they're very sensitive to that. Is it really just a passive enterprise, or are you actually going to be earning revenue? So you always want to kind of think about that when you're doing a real estate based business. Sometimes just filing venue. So where you're filing. Some consulates have a really good system for E-2s. They're very familiar with E-2s. For example, London. However, there are some consulates that are less familiar with E-2s, and sometimes, consular officers are kind of going between various consulates. We're getting, kind of new interpretations of what's acceptable, and that can always happen. So you always want to talk with your attorney about, where you're filing and if it's really a friendly E-2 location. As we mentioned with USCIS, in some ways there are some benefits, they're okay with lower investment amounts. However, they really have a strict view of the source and trail of funds, and you won't get a visa. You won't be able to travel internationally. You just get that approval to go within the United States. Other reasons for denials, like let's say you ran a similar business in your home country for many years and you never hired employees, that can be a red flag. Going along with that, concern over whether your business is going to create jobs for U.S. workers. That's always, something they're very attuned to. It's really key to be able to show that you're going to have those jobs for U.S. workers. So you need a good business plan. And if you think that if it's possible for your business, you really want to perhaps hire an employee even before filing, although that's not required, but it does help. Sometimes you may have an issue with the adjudicating officer. The officers have complete discretion over whether to grant or deny the visa, and there's not an appeal process. However, if you reapply, most consulates will make an effort to give you a different officer. It's not guaranteed, but I think, good thing to know. And sometimes, you didn't meet the requirements at the time of filing. So sometimes we had a client that came to us after a denial and they had spent $2,000 and put $98,000 in a business bank account. So that, they just functionally did not meet the requirements. There was no substantial investment that was at risk and irrevocably committed. We worked with them to get their expenditure amount up and they were ultimately approved. All right, let's talk about renewing the E-2 visa. Hiring U.S. workers is key to getting a renewal approved. As Michaela mentioned previously, a recommendation is at least 3 to 4 full-time equivalent U.S. workers in 5 years. The amount of the salary doesn't matter. That being said, the salary should make sense in light of what the person is doing, right? So, if you're saying you're hiring a software engineer, and you're paying the minimum wage, they could question that. So you just want to, it's fine to say, here's my employees and I'm paying the minimum wage, and that's fine. But it should generally make sense in light of the type of work that they're doing. Other things that they'll look for are updated financial data. So tax returns, some consulates ask for tax returns for the last 1 or 2 years. Some ask for the tax returns from the last time you renewed. Some ask for all the tax returns the company's ever filed. They will look to see, is the company making money? Are the revenues either consistent or growing? Is the company profitable, or at least, not losing money? They'll ask to see the payroll information. They want the W-2s and any 1099s. If the, if the company is not really doing very well, sometimes this has come up a lot with COVID. What are your plans to hire employees? Have you hired many employees over the years and you've just had a lot of employee turnover? These are all important things to kind of raise so that you can show the consulate you've made efforts to hire, you've paid U.S. employees over the years, even if you have a low amount of employees during your time of renewal. Also very important to show the company still meets the E-2 requirements. So if there's been changes to ownership, you still need to show the company is at least 50% owned by treaty country nationals. And if the company is, if you're the investor, you need to still own at least 50%. If there's changes to the type of business, you need to either explain those, as a natural outgrowth of the business. Perhaps it was contemplated in your initial business plan. If it was, then that's okay. But if it's a substantial change, that could potentially be an issue for renewal. I think there was one question I recall that, was asking, do they look back at the initial business plan you submit when you renew? In my experience, they really don't. So even if, let's say that you said that by year 5, you'd be making $700,000, but you're only making $500,000. I've never seen that be an issue. Their focus is really on, are your revenues growing or consistent? Have you hired U.S. workers? As long as you've done those things, even if you haven't met your projections, generally you still, can get approved. I don't find that they're really fixating on what were your initial business plan projections. So I know we have several questions, so we'll turn to those now. So one person asked, what does it mean to put your money at risk? Does this mean the officer can deny you the visa with no good reason? So what this means, one of the E-2 requirements is that the funds must be irrevocably committed and at risk in the commercial sense. And what this means is that you as the investor have to actually spend your money on things. And that's what they mean by putting your money at risk. So when you spend your money on various E-2 expenditures and you don't know if the business will succeed or fail, your money is then at risk. So that's what they want to see. Money in a business bank account is not at risk because that money could always just be pulled out of the account by you as an owner. But if that money has actually been spent on something and is committed to various E-2 expenditures, like setting up the business website, paying for computer equipment, paying an employee, like those things show that your money is at risk. So that's what that means. So somebody asked, Michaela, is the E-2 not the right type of visa if the intention is to found a startup? So, and is there a possibility to apply for an immigrant visa? So I think this question is really asking, so is the E-2 visa the right type for a startup business who wants to run an operation? And also, does an E-2 visa lead to a green card?
Yeah, so so E-2 visa is definitely a great option if you want to kind of like start a startup in the US, but you do need to make kind of like the substantial upfront investment to qualify for the E-2 visa. And regarding some immigrant visa options, so we actually have a webinar, I believe upcoming either in March or April, that discusses different types of green cards for entrepreneurs. So yeah, you could definitely attend the webinar to kind of like find out, what would be your options to either go straight for the green card or to do E-2 visa and switch to the green card later.
Exactly right. And I think, there's no non-immigrant visa. Like the E-2 doesn't lead to any green card. I mean, the same way an L or an H doesn't lead to any green card. But if there's a green card that's available to you while you're on that visa, you can apply for it. And our other webinars will go over that kind of process in much more detail. So someone else has asked, Michaela, can you bring employees with you?
Yeah. So, so there are a couple of requirements, for E2 employees. So, the US company would need to be owned at least 50% by the E2 treaty country nationals. So let's say, for example, that you own 100% of the US company and you are, for example, a UK national, then yes, you can bring UK national employees to the US. And there are basically three categories of employees you could bring. So you could bring an executive employee, a managerial employee, or a specialized skills employee.
Perfect. So someone's asked whether it's, do we suggest to deposit money into an escrow account or a seller business account? So, I mean, this is the choice of the applicant, but the benefit of an escrow account, when you're purchasing a business, you get this extra benefit of your money is considered at risk and irrevocably committed if you transfer it into escrow as opposed to transferring it directly to the seller. That only works when the only condition for the release of the funds is the approval of the E-2 visa. So I think that if you have that option and the seller is agreeable, then I think it's a good option because it just protects you in the event your visa is not approved. What can I do if I have the money, but my country puts limits on the amount of money I can move outside the US? Can I take money in cash each time if I visit the US frequently? So I think that as long as you're declaring as long as there's a trail of the money and you're declaring the cash each time you enter and have that proof, it is possible to do it that way. However, I think that if you're planning to apply with USCIS, that can make things much more complex because once money is transferred out of a bank account and is just being held in cash, USCIS can sometimes be very reluctant to, kind of like when that money shows up again in another bank account, sometimes they're very reluctant to connect that trail. So I think it's usually better to find alternate, means, either by talking with a cross-border accountant, to figure out how to legally move your money in such a way that there's a trail. But it is possible to do that. Again, though, it should be declared properly each time, and you should keep that documentation, for your E-2 application. Do you need to go to the same consulate as your nationality, or can you go to another country close to where you are? So if you live in another country outside your country of nationality, you can generally apply there. One exception for that are nationals of the UK. There's a residency requirement, so you have to actually be a resident of the United Kingdom and actually be domiciled there and live there in order to qualify for the E-2 visa. So Michaela, someone's asked, if somebody wants to change their status to E-2, how can they bring their dependents from their home country and can they be denied?
Yeah, so if you, as the main applicant, change status, your dependents can still apply for the E-2 visas at a consulate. And the Foreign Affairs Manual was actually kind of like recently updated to specifically allow this. So they would just need your approval notice and marriage certificate, birth certificates for the children. Bring this documentation and apply for the visa. Regarding denial, this is always going to depend on the particular consular officer, do the applicants have any kind of prior immigration issues or anything like that? But if they don't, the E-2 visa, the E-2 dependent visa should generally be pretty straightforward.
Perfect. So someone said, what about Pakistan U.S. consulate? I'm not sure what this question is asking, but if you have specific questions about kind of filing E-2 visas, you can certainly, set up consultations with us. The consulates in Pakistan do process E-2 visas, although we find they are, can be quite difficult to get approved. Can you take a loan or gift from your brother who's an American citizen and living in the US? Yes, you can. As long as there's a source of funds, that's fine. If you visit outside the US in between the visa period, does the reapplication need to be done from scratch, the same as a brand new one? I'm not quite sure what this is asking, but even if what you're asking is you have an E-2 visa, then it expires, and then you apply after the expiration, it would still be a renewal as long as the company was continuing to operate. Yes, you can change status while in the US, but only if you are here on a valid status. So let's say that you came on ESTA, you could not change status. That doesn't allow for a change of status. As an E-2 employee of the investor, how quick can my spouse get a work permit? So the good news is that E-2 spouses now can work without a work permit. They can, when they enter the United States, they should just make sure that they were given an I-94 that's classified E-2S for spouse, and that alone should be enough to allow them to start working right away. So someone's asking, they're looking to acquire a business. Are you allowed to buy a second business and combine them on an E-2 visa? So Michaela, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, it's going to depend like what's the second business, but, generally you would want to kind of like notify, the consulate before, kind of like buying the, additional business, kind of especially if the new business, if the second business is, doing something completely like different than the, original business.
Perfect. How long is the E-2 visa for the employee of the investor? So it depends on the reciprocity schedule of your country. So like, let's say that you're a national of Canada, they can get visas for 5 years. So you as an employee can get the visa for 5 years. Sometimes if the country has a registration system like London does, they might change, they might truncate it so it's to the end of the registration period, but generally it's going to follow just the reciprocity schedule for your country. Is a purchase of property for the business instead of renting office space considered an investment? It can be. It certainly can be. It really depends on the type of business that you have, like what role that property is going to play in your business. Like, let's say you're opening a manufacturing plant and you purchase a property and you're going to have your offices there and have a manufacturing business there, then certainly yes. You just want to be careful about, if you have a mortgage on the property, that might kind of play into it. Any amount that's kind of mortgaged is not going, that's basically a loan secured by the assets of the E-2 business, which is the property, is not going to count towards the investment. So we've already talked about the main reasons for renewals being, we've talked about kind of common reasons for E-2 visas being denied, and for renewals, it's really, if the company is not, if the company is not hired employees, if the company is not profitable, if the company's revenues are going down, all those things are general reasons why. When such investment, I'm not sure what this is asking, when such investment is justified and when wouldn't it be? If that's about the property, we just talked about that, and, happy to talk further about it during a consult. So if you would like to reach out to us after, reach out to us through our email that's publicly available. We're happy to send you our engagement letters that outline our fees and services. When do you generally recommend to schedule a consultation? I think, it's really up to each individual client. We have people that, consult with us right at the start because they just want to get that information of how to structure things. And we have people that have already done their own research. So I'd say that's really a personal choice, and feel free to check out all of our free resources, including our E-2 visa guide, when deciding when to set up a consultation. So can you please elaborate on what happens if the investment is financed by the owner of the business as security? So you cannot do that for your investment. It won't count as your E-2 investment. So let's say you took out a loan and it's secured by the assets of the E-2 company. None of that counts as your investment. So it's not possible to do in the E-2 context. If you invest, so, it is possible to, you're not converting your E2 to an EB5, but it is possible to be on an E2 and invest enough money over the years to qualify for an EB5. And that's also covered in one of our other webinars that goes over, kind of transitioning from an E2 to a green card. So I would encourage you to check out that webinar as well. But yes, it is possible if you do meet those requirements. But there is very specific ways you need to do it because you can't just kind of leave profits in the company. It has to be kind of your personal capital, and the source and trail of funds requirements for EB5 are significantly heightened over the E2. How do you prove you're resident in the UK? Do you need to have stayed for a specific period? The UK, they'll generally take a very holistic view. So like, let's say that you grew up in the UK, you lived there, then you went away for university, maybe you traveled for a couple of years, now you're living back there. That's generally going to be okay. They do usually want to see recent, debit charges there, recent, kind of utility bills, proof of employment in the UK. So they will sometimes take a holistic view, but it's fact specific. So if you've never lived there permanently, then you're not going to qualify. If at the time of renewal you want to change the business, can you apply for a new E2? Michaela, can you answer this one?
Yeah, sure. So, if you want to start kind of like a completely different business, then yeah, it may be best to kind of like apply for a new E2 and kind of like submit a new business plan and just kind of describe like what the new business will be doing.
Perfect. And can you travel outside the US while on an E2 visa, Michaela?
Yeah, so as long as you have a valid E2 visa, you can travel in and out internationally, but you always need that valid visa to be able to come back to the US.
Right. And someone's asking if you marry while on an E2, is transferring that visa easy and done in the US? I'm not quite sure what this is asking. If you marry a US citizen and you want to kind of apply for a green card based on that relationship while you're in the US, yes, that is possible. If what you meant is you get married and now you want to bring over your spouse as an E2 dependent, that is also possible. Someone's buying a business in New York State, grocery store, liquor and lotto license. The license can't be transferred. So if I bought the business 50%, we have to notify the license authority. So this is a very fact-specific question. So what I'd say, I'd recommend kind of setting up a consultation to talk through that specific, issue. But generally what I can say is when you do have a licensing requirement like that, it's something you will have to work through. And if you aren't able to get the license by the time you file, you just want to be able to explain to the consulate that you have a plan to get that license. And if you're not able to operate until you have the license, that can be a risk factor for the application. So sometimes you get a US partner that might be able to assist. So there's many different ways you can kind of address it, but it's, I'd say, very fact specific. What if the petitioner at one point was an illegal alien and married another one, later left the US? Can they include the wife just back they married in the US while both being illegal aliens? The fact, if you ever were in the United States, in illegal status, that could certainly impact whether or not you're eligible for the visa. So that's something that would require a consultation to discuss, because it's just, there's not enough information, to kind of answer in this forum. So can a home office count, Michaela?
And we have kind of like recently processed some cases where the company, everyone was just kind of like working from home, but it does strengthen the application if the company has a commercial lease agreement or kind of like a WeWork, at least designated desks. So yeah, you can at consulates, you can probably kind of like get by just with home office, but it does help the application if you have a commercial lease.
Perfect. So the procedure for overcoming a denial. So it's not possible to overcome a denial. What you can do is you can reapply and try to address the reasons they gave you for the denial. So there's a few different questions here asking about kind of the possibility of loaning money to the E2 business as your investment. So that's not possible to do for the E2. the money has, you as an individual can take out a loan. So you as an individual can take out an unsecured loan or a loan secured by your own personal property that's not the E2 property, but you cannot loan money to the E2 enterprise. It has to be an irrevocably committed investment of your personal capital. So it's not possible to loan the money to the E2 company. Is there a better chance to get approved if you apply with only yourself rather than with all 4 kids and your wife? No, I don't think so. You know, obviously there's caveats. If there was, you know, particular red flags with any of your spouse or children, any immigrant petitions pending or anything like that, but generally no, it's fine to apply with your spouse and children. Michaela, if you decide to do an E1 instead of an E2, do you still need to have employees?
Yeah, so no, you don't need to have employees on an E1 visa, and that's kind of like one advantage of the E1. Yeah, no employees necessary for the E1.
Perfect. Yeah, so somebody's asked, Michaela, if you have a British passport, but you've never lived there, how long do you have to live there before applying for an E2?
Yeah, so as Kelly mentioned before, so there's kind of like, you know, like no set like you know, like timeline, and they kind of like the concept looks at it holistically. I mean, I would recommend to live there you know, at least perhaps like several months, like a year, you know, before you apply there.
Right. And I think if you've never lived in the UK, I think that would be quite difficult to make that kind of holistic argument. Like many people may be able to live there for a few months, you know, if they've kind of lived there and then gone abroad. But if you've never lived there, I think that you would really need to live there for quite a while to kind of establish, you know, that you would kind of meet that requirement for, you know, to be have ongoing residency in the UK. Perfect. So someone is planning to do your renewal without an attorney, but is it possible to have a consultation to clarify some points? Absolutely. So people, you know, sometimes will have a consultation with us just to discuss kind of, you know, different questions they have when they plan to do their own petitions. And that is certainly, you know, fine. Are Canadian consulates particularly tough to get approvals and a recommended higher investment? So the consulate in Canada is generally quite good. We process there very frequently and sometimes with, you know, I'd say what I call very low investment amounts, which are investment amounts under 100,000, you know, between usually around 60,000 to 100,000. So I'd say it is quite a good consulate. All consulates, I think right now are undergoing a bit of an issue. You know, as they're training, you know, but generally Canada is a good consulate. How much money per year does the investment need to make in order to be approved or renewed? There is no exact figure, but the company needs to support, you know, needs to be able to support at least 3 to 4 full-time employees and be profitable. So that's something to keep in mind. Is it possible to have a sales business agreement? The business is transferred on visa approval due to licensing issues. Again, that's a kind of very fact specific, something that I'd suggest discussing during a consultation, but certainly if there's a business arrangement that allows you to get the licensing in place that you need before visa approval, then, you know, that's certainly something I think that is worthwhile to explore. So thank you everyone for your wonderful questions. Thank you, Michaela, for sharing your knowledge, and I hope everybody has a wonderful day.
Thank you. Bye.